The United States initiated an undeclared military campaign against Iran on February 28, 2026, in coordination with Israeli forces, targeting nuclear facilities, military installations, and senior leadership including Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. This action represented a preemptive strike framework justified under claims of self-defense against prior Iranian threats and proxy activities directed at American interests. The conflict rapidly escalated through Iranian retaliatory missile and drone barrages aimed at United States bases in the Gulf region and Israeli population centers, producing a pattern of sustained air and naval exchanges that extended to proxy theaters in Lebanon and other Gulf states. By March 31, 2026, the operation had generated measurable human costs across multiple parties, with casualty figures reflecting both direct combat and collateral impacts from precision strikes on mixed military-civilian targets. Casualty assessments revealed distinct profiles for each participant. American losses stood at 13 to 15 military service members, all resulting from Iranian strikes on facilities such as those in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, alongside incidents including a KC-135 refueling aircraft crash over Iraq. Iranian deaths ranged from 1,900 to 3,492, encompassing a mixture of military personnel and civilians, with documented strikes on schools and hospitals contributing to child fatalities estimated between 180 and 236. Israeli casualties totaled 19 to 28, predominantly civilians from missile impacts on residential areas such as Beit Shemesh, supplemented by a smaller number of soldiers engaged in Lebanon-related operations. These numbers remained fluid amid ongoing barrages, underscoring the asymmetric nature of the engagements and the persistent risk of further escalation. The domestic dimensions of the conflict introduced immediate concerns regarding embedded foreign networks within the United States. With an estimated 750,000 Iranian Americans residing in the country under various legal statuses, the simultaneous prosecution of overseas strikes created a structural tension. Reports indicated the presence of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps-linked individuals, with up to 1,000 such associates identified in Canada and speculative assessments placing the comparable figure in the United States in the low hundreds organized into tens of small cells. This configuration, combined with historical patterns of open border policies and global mobility, positioned American civilians in a state of heightened exposure where rapid transnational movement could enable swift retaliation by motivated actors responding to family losses or ideological imperatives. Casualty dynamics and motivational factors for retaliation. The progression of casualty counts throughout March 2026 highlighted the interplay between military objectives and civilian harm that amplified potential retaliatory incentives. Initial American deaths numbered 6, rising steadily to 13 through 15 as Iranian responses targeted logistical hubs and aviation assets. Iranian figures, drawn from health ministry and independent monitoring data, consistently incorporated substantial civilian components, including over 200 school children killed in strikes on educational facilities in locations such as Minab. Israeli tallies remained lower, centered on urban missile impacts that produced clusters of civilian fatalities alongside limited military losses in supporting operations. These distributions illustrated how the conflict's conduct generated grievances among affected populations, particularly when family members or community ties were severed by strikes on non-combat infrastructure. Motivational elements for potential internal responses extended beyond immediate bereavement to encompass doctrinal and ideological frameworks. Iranian-linked associates, whether directly affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard or operating through proxy networks, operated within a context where religious tenets emphasizing defensive struggle and strategic deception provided interpretive lenses for action. The presence of these networks inside North America, evidenced by the Canadian estimate of 1,000 regime-connected individuals and parallel those smaller United States assessments, created pathways for activation triggered by real-time conflict developments. Global connectivity further facilitated such responses, as individuals could traverse borders or utilize air routes to enter the United States within days, transforming overseas casualties into domestic security variables. The cumulative effect positioned the United States as a potential target for asymmetric countermeasures originating from within its own territory. The undeclared character of the initial strikes, executed without formal congressional authorization, compounded perceptions of unilateral escalation that could motivate not only direct Revolutionary Guard assets but also broader sympathizer circles. This dynamic underscored a feedback loop wherein external military decisions generated internal vulnerabilities, with civilian and military deaths abroad serving as catalysts for localized threats that existing monitoring systems had to address through heightened vigilance rather than preventive restructuring. Embedded foreign networks and border realities. The scale of Iranian-associated populations within the United States and adjacent territories formed a central element of the security landscape. The 750,000 Iranian Americans, distributed across states including California and Texas, included legal residents and citizens alongside those entering through varied immigration pathways accumulated over decades. Within this demographic, a subset maintained ties to Iranian governmental or military institutions, with open-source evaluations placing Revolutionary Guard-linked operatives in the low hundreds organized into small cellular structures. Parallel reporting from Canadian sources identified up to 1,000 such individuals, raising concerns about cross-border permeability along the 5,500-mile frontier that remained largely unfortified in remote sectors. Border enforcement patterns contributed to the establishment of these networks. Historical inflows through southern crossings, visa overstays, and asylum procedures allowed entry for Iranian nationals, with encounter data from prior years indicating thousands of interactions that included individuals possessing prior military or security affiliations. Global mobility eliminated traditional geographic buffers, enabling rapid transit from conflict zones to American soil via commercial or private aviation within 24 to 48 hours. This reality transformed the presence of embedded actors from a theoretical risk into an operational factor, particularly when overseas strikes generated fresh grievances among family members or ideological adherents. The configuration of these networks introduced challenges for detection and management. Intelligence indicators pointed to dormant assets capable of responding to operational signals, with activities focused on surveillance, planning, or proxy facilitation rather than large-scale deployments. The absence of comprehensive internal vetting mechanisms prior to the conflict's onset left authorities reliant on reactive monitoring, as the sheer volume of the diaspora and the diversity of entry methods complicated exhaustive tracking. Consequently, the domestic environment reflected a legacy of policy choices that permitted foreign military-affiliated elements to establish footholds while the state pursued aggressive external engagements. Historical precedents for internal threat management. Non-American states confronting analogous challenges of embedded foreign agents during periods of conflict have employed structured intelligence and administrative responses. In the United Kingdom during the Second World War, security services utilized signals intelligence and human sources to identify and neutralize German operatives through a double-agent program that converted threats into assets for disinformation. Concurrent internment policies detained thousands of enemy nationals under emergency regulations, achieving disruption of sabotage efforts while managing perceived internal risks. These measures operated within a framework of wartime authority that prioritized rapid classification and containment over prolonged legal proceedings. Post-conflict expulsions in Czechoslovakia and Poland between 1945 and 1948 addressed populations identified as security liabilities through census records and collaboration assessments. Millions of ethnic Germans faced organized deportation under international agreements, resulting in the removal of communities viewed as potential fifth columns. The process achieved demographic reconfiguration but incurred significant humanitarian consequences, including documented civilian hardships during transit. Such actions demonstrated the capacity of states to enact large-scale population movements when empowered by victory and allied consensus. In the Middle East and Southeast Asia, targeted operational doctrines provided additional models. Israeli intelligence services developed infiltration and surveillance techniques to map and neutralize embedded terrorist networks, employing precise actions that combined arrest, deportation, and selective elimination to degrade capabilities. Singapore maintained a preventive detention system under internal security legislation that allowed warrantless holding of foreign-linked subversives, effectively neutralizing insurgent and extremist elements through intelligence-driven internment and removal. These approaches illustrated varying degrees of success in threat elimination, often balancing immediate security gains against longer-term relational or reputational costs within the constraints of prevailing legal and political environments. Legal constraints on civilian self-defense and reliance on state institutions. United States legal structures explicitly prohibit the formation of private militias or paramilitary organizations, channeling all defensive and enforcement functions through governmental authorities. The Second Amendment safeguards individual firearm possession for lawful purposes but does not extend to organized military-style groups operating independently of state oversight. Supreme Court precedents affirm that states retain authority to ban unauthorized associations for military training or public armed activity, with every jurisdiction maintaining statutes criminalizing such conduct when it involves drilling, parading, or assuming law enforcement roles without official sanction. These provisions reflect a constitutional design intended to preserve the monopoly on legitimate force within elected institutions. Citizens encountering threats from foreign military-linked actors or associated groups must therefore direct responses exclusively through established agencies. Federal entities, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, manage counterintelligence and terrorism investigations, while the Department of Homeland Security coordinates suspicious activity reporting and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Service addresses immigration violations tied to regime affiliations. Emergency response begins with local law enforcement via standard emergency protocols, followed by escalation to specialized national security channels for any foreign agent dimension. This architecture compels reliance on institutions responsible for both border policy and wartime decision-making, creating an inherent dependency when those same bodies have facilitated the conditions giving rise to the threats. The resulting framework leaves civilians without independent recourse for organized self-protection, positioning them in a relationship of compelled dependence upon governmental mechanisms that may face competing priorities or internal limitations. While lawful self-defense remains available under state-specific doctrines in immediate confrontations, broader community-level organization outside official auspices constitutes a prohibited activity subject to criminal penalties. This arrangement underscores the systemic channeling of citizen concerns into electoral, legislative, and reporting pathways as the sole avenues for addressing perceived vulnerabilities arising from concurrent foreign engagements and domestic demographic realities. Operational realities and governmental responsibilities. Governmental institutions bear the operational burden of managing embedded threats amid active overseas hostilities. Heightened alerts issued by intelligence and security agencies reflect recognition of activation risks stemming from encrypted communications and conflict-related grievances. Monitoring encompasses financial flows, travel patterns, and community networks to identify potential operational triggers, with emphasis on prepositioned assets rather than newly dispatched forces. Deportation proceedings for identified regime-linked non-citizens represent a primary administrative tool, supplemented by criminal prosecutions for material support or conspiracy offenses. The intersection of war prosecution and internal security exposes structural tensions within executive and legislative functions. Decisions to initiate strikes without formal declaration placed military objectives ahead of comprehensive domestic risk mitigation, leaving unresolved the presence of foreign-affiliated personnel whose motivations could intensify in response to reported casualties. Border and immigration policies accumulated over decades contributed to the establishment of these networks, generating a scenario where external aggression coexists with internal exposure. Agencies tasked with protection operate under constitutional and statutory constraints that prioritize due process and intelligence-led action over preemptive population measures. Public engagement remains confined to informational support and democratic advocacy. Citizens contribute through tip submissions and electoral participation, channeling frustrations into demands for enhanced vetting, deportation priorities, and legislative adjustments. The absence of alternative organizational pathways reinforces the centrality of state institutions in threat management, even as those institutions navigate the consequences of prior policy frameworks that permitted entry and retention of the very elements now posing risks during active conflict. Conclusion: what the 2026 Iran conflict means for American safety and embedded foreign network. The 2026 Iran conflict illustrates the convergence of external military action and internal demographic configurations that generate sustained security challenges. Casualty patterns across American, Iranian, and Israeli participants reveal the human dimensions of asymmetric warfare, while embedded networks within the United States and Canada introduce pathways for retaliation rooted in both personal losses and ideological frameworks. The scale of the Iranian-American population and the documented presence of Revolutionary Guard-associated individuals underscore the limitations of geographic separation in an era of rapid global transit. Historical precedents from other nations demonstrate the feasibility of decisive internal threat management through intelligence fusion and administrative authority, yet United States legal prohibitions on private militias enforce exclusive reliance upon federal and local agencies for identification and removal. This dependency arises directly from policy legacies that facilitated inflows while simultaneous decisions to engage Iran abroad amplified motivational factors for domestic responses. Citizens encounter threats without independent organizational capacity, directing all concerns through reporting mechanisms and political processes. The overall configuration reflects a systemic arrangement wherein governmental institutions assume responsibility for both the generation and resolution of vulnerabilities. The resulting dynamic positions American civilians in a state of structured exposure, reliant upon the same entities whose prior actions contributed to the presence of foreign military-linked elements. Comprehensive resolution requires sustained focus on intelligence operations, immigration enforcement, and legislative calibration to align domestic security postures with the realities of ongoing foreign engagements.